Hi everyone, Christina Werner here with another video for SimonsStamp.com. Today I'm using the Tropical Silhouette stamp set to create a summertime card. This is the card sketch that I've come up with, and the basic idea is I'm going to be creating a background with lots of layered stamping and gold embossing on top, and then I'm going to adhere it on a little bit of a diagonal onto a white card front and stamp some leaves coming from behind that diagonal background. So here we go. I'm going to start out by stamping that background. I have the flamingo from the Tropical Silhouette set here, and it's going to serve as sort of like a focal point for my background. It's the only pink area on the card, and at this point, I thought I would keep the flamingo pink, but later on you'll see that I'll do some gold embossing on top. I'm using some Hollyhock ink from Simons Stamp, and I must have had a little bit of dust or something on my stamp this first time stamping it. So luckily, I was using my MISTI stamp positioning tool, and the stamp was still on the door of the MISTI, so I just inked it up again for the second time and stamped again. And then I got a better impression, and it sort of filled in those gaps on my stamp. So now I'm going to move on to stamping all of the leaves. There are quite a few leaves in this stamp set. It's a 6x8 set, so there's lots of stamps on it. Starting out with the color Jelly Bean from Simon. And this is a nice bright green. I'm going to have 3 different colors of green ink used on this card, so I can get a really fun layered look. My second color is actually called Fern, and it is the darkest green of the 3 that I'm using today. And I'm mostly using this particular ink color on these large flat leaves. So I'll stamp that one down. And then the third color is actually Green Leaf. It's a little bit more of a mid-tone green, very earthy. And I'm going to be stamping that over on the side, kind of overlapping each image. So I'm going to speed up the video so you can see the stamping process, but basically I'm turning and rotating that background and alternating which images I'm using, having them nestle up against that flamingo and overlap. I'm making sure I have spots for the dark green leaves so that they can layer on top as well. So this very last little section, I'm going to take all 3 of those more flat leaves and stamp them all at the same time, and it's going to finish off that top corner. I'm going to rotate this back around and add 1 more of those flat leaves at the bottom, and then we're going to do some ink blending. I'm taking that Hollyhock color once again, and I'm using an ink blending tool from Honeybee. And I just want a very soft sort of pink halo around the flamingo. This is going to give me lots of color for that center area of my background. So after I had the pink all blended on, then I switched colors, I switched blending brushes and went to the color Fern. Remember, this is the darker green. And I'm just going to bring that in along the edges. I don't want this green ink blending to overlap the pink too much, because kind of pink and green overlapped, you get a little bit of a grayish mud color. So I just tried to avoid that. Decided I needed to have 1 more darker stamp right there next to the flamingo. So I'm going to put that in my MISTI tool and stamp this large flat leaf. And I stamped it twice for a nice solid impression. So I'm going to take my heat tool and go over this whole area. Now these inks are dry to the touch really quickly, but if you're planning to do any heat embossing over the top, you're going to have to let it dry a little bit longer or use a heat tool to speed up the drying process. And then you're going to test the area with some heat embossing before you do any stamping, because otherwise you might end up with a mess. So I'm using a powder tool. This is an anti-static powder tool. And then I'm going to sprinkle on some of this gilded embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. Testing it out, making sure that it slides right off that cardstock before I go into my stamping. Luckily, my background was ready to go, so I put it back into my MISTI tool and started stamping these sort of organic dot shapes. I just want them overlapping the leaves, coming into a little bit of that pink area, adding some gold accents. prepping that area with an anti-static powder tool once again, and then stamping these images in Versamark ink. Versamark is a sticky ink and it's perfect for heat embossing. In fact, it stays pretty sticky for a while. So I actually applied the gilded embossing powder, this gold embossing powder. I applied it, and before I heat set it, I put the background back into my MISTI tool and stamped a few more of these elements. So I was able to heat emboss a few stampings all in one go. I added a bunch more of the heat embossing as well because I wanted to make sure there were plenty of gold accents on this background. So I'm going to add the flamingo in gold now. I decided I would offset it a little bit from the pink and then have that gold right over the top. And we'll get a little bit of a pink shadow around the flamingo. I did this because I loved this gold so much, but it was sort of getting hidden with all that layered stamping, and I wanted to make sure that I had plenty of gold on my card. So I used a dry brush just to brush away any stray embossing powder. This will come in handy later when I do the border of gold on this background as well. So I'll heat set this, and then now I've got a lot of gold happening on this. If you wanted to, you could totally skip the whole stamping the flamingo in pink and just do the gold and maybe do the ink blending around it, but I think this turned out really cool. So I have my background on my card front at a diagonal so that I can position my greeting stamp. And once I have that stamp positioned on my card front, I'll just put it up in the top corner of my MISTI, put a magnet down, and prep the area for embossing. Prepped it with an anti-static powder tool, stamped my greeting in Versamark ink, and then applied some of that gilded embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. So here's where that dry brush is going to come in handy. Once again, this is going to get that embossing powder out of those areas where I don't want it so that I can heat set it and have a nice clean card base. Okay, so I wanted to do some stamping coming from behind my background. And I want these leaves that I'm going to stamp to be a very pale gray. But I also know from experience that these photopolymer stamps from Simon, as well as the Simon ink, when you put those two together, it kind of stains the stamps and it holds onto the ink really, really well. So before I stamp my background, I'm going to do some test stamping. So the gray ink I'm using today is Fog. It's a very nice, very pale gray ink. I'm going to ink up these leaves, and you'll see when I stamp it down onto the grid paper inside my MISTI that they are still very green. They're pale because there's not a lot of ink there, but they're still very green. So I used the Simasys Stamp Ultra Clean stamp cleaner, and I applied that to my stamps, wiped them down with a paper towel, trying to remove as much of that green ink as possible. Then I used some scratch paper. I just folded over my grid paper I used earlier, and I stamped these a bunch of times with that Fog ink. And in each stamping, less and less green appeared. So it got to be pretty gray that I was happy with, so I decided to go ahead and stamp my card. So I inked that up and then pressed that down right onto the front of my card. And I got a nice soft gray color with a little tint of green, but not so much that it's super noticeable. So back to that background, I took my Versamark pad and rubbed it along the edges. Now these two edges, the bottom and the right edge, are the only ones that are going to show on my card. So those are the only two I bothered with. I dipped that into my gold embossing powder and then brushed off a little bit of that because it was a little too thick for my liking. And then dipped in the other side and did the same. I just brush a little bit of that off. It gives it a very organic edge. And then when I heat set this, I have a gold edge on my background. So this is going to give me lots of that gold that I was wanting for my card design. I then applied some foam adhesive on the back of my background and also in the corner on my card base. And then I applied or adhered my background to my card base at a diagonal. We're almost done here. We just have to lop off all that extra on the side. So I used a ruler and a craft knife. This is the Tim Holtz craft knife. And that is going to even up the sides and the top on my card, and it'll be the perfect size for sending in the mail. So this card altogether from the sketch, it's very similar to the sketch. I think the only thing that I did differently was I made that flamingo gold, and I'm glad I did. I really love how that turned out. If you would like to make any projects with the supplies I've used today, they are available over at simonsthestamp.com. Please check out the supply list down in the video description. Thanks for watching today, and I will see you guys in another video very soon.